Hello, welcome to ME 510, Economics and Policy of Engineered Energy Systems. This presentation is part two of our two-part module on wind and solar energy. In this presentation, we'll focus on wind power generation, specifically in the US, with some comments about wind installations around the world. So when you look at the installation trends for wind power, you'll see that it's actually had a growing trend. In 2015, there was a surge in installations with over 8.5 billion megawatts, billion watts of new capacity added in the US and $14.5 billion of investment. Even though the US is having a significant push towards wind power, we're not leading. China actually has been installing as much, if not more, wind power generation. Um, in the US, what's been driving installations is Texas, actually. Um, Other states like California, Iowa have also been installing quite a bit of wind power, with 12 states meeting or exceeding 10% wind energy penetration. One particular development that we'll be keeping an eye on is offshore turbines. We've seen around the world projects occur in this area. The US is lagging a little bit behind, but we expect that in 2016, some of these offshore turbines will start being added around the coast of the United States. These installations, as we'll learn later, the manufacturing of the turbines is being led by GE and Vestas, with over 73% of the wind power market. Iowa is a major manufacturer of wind turbines, and so we'll see that later on, how it compares in terms of other locations around the US. One particular item of importance in terms of the wind power installations is that most of them are owned by independent power producers, and they tend to engage in long-term contracts with utilities as their offtake agreement. But once in a while, you do have direct retail sales, particularly to specific companies that are trying to generate more green power in order to further their green initiatives. Uh, in the technology side, we've seen that wind turbines have been gaining capacity, height, and rotor diameter. So we're learning how to produce these turbines more efficiently, or engineer them more efficiently, and that is helping in terms of the resilience of the installations that we have and the overall capacity per site and location. In terms of cost, we've seen that wind turbine prices have been low, uh, much lower than the prices that were seen several years ago. So they are achieving some amount of learning in terms of reducing their cost. Um, these lower turbine prices have driven reductions in the reported installed project costs. So we're seeing savings on the equipment side, but also on the management side. So when you have large wind farms, there are some costs associated with the controls of the wind farms, the service, maintenance, and those costs are also going down. In terms of policy, these wind power installations, just as with solar power and other renewable energy initiatives, have been driven by federal incentives. Um, and so extensions of incentives like the renewable portfolio standards have been leading a resurgent domestic market in the United States. There are some state policies as well that try to steer the location and amount of wind power development. Okay. One specific challenge with wind power installations and solar photovoltaics is that often transmitting the power from the generation locations to the end consumer often requires installations of new transmission lines. In terms of the timely delivery of that energy, we know that storing electricity from wind turbines and solar photovoltaics can be a challenge. We don't have robust battery solutions that are cost effective. And so that's another potential barrier for the continued installation of wind and solar power. Essentially, any intermittent source of energy. Now, if we look at the cumulative capacity and annual U.S. capacity addition in the United States, you can see here that there have been several years where the number of additions have been increasing. We see up to 2009 a rapid increase in the additions of wind power capacity, followed by a decline, and in 2012 a resurgence again of installation of wind power capacity. Many of these different swings in installation capacity have to do with federal decisions in terms of what kinds of incentives and programs they put in place. We can see that the investment in this industry has a strong relation with federal programs and federal decisions. We see again in 2015 a growing trend in terms of wind installations. Now, as the cost of wind turbines, wind power continues to decrease, we'll see a decoupling of wind investment from federal programs due to, again, more competitive economic prices from these investments. If we look at the percentage of generation capacity additions across the US, you can see that different regions have been investing in different types of power. In the interior, particularly the Midwest and maybe parts of Texas, you can see that wind power has been leading the way in terms of additions, with over 54% of the additions between 2006 and 2015. The Great Lakes area, also part of the Midwest here, with 48%. In the West and Northeast and Southeast regions, we see that natural gas has been the dominating strategy to reduce emissions from the power sector. Coal having a much lower effect, or actually negligible effect. Solar energy has been concentrated in the West. Places like California have been investing heavily in solar photovoltaics. Overall, wind power represents about 31% of the generation capacity additions during this time period. We mentioned earlier how the United States, despite its tremendous growth in wind power, still falls behind China. And if you look at the annual capacity, China is several factors ahead of everybody else. And in terms of additions, similarly, China has been investing heavily and continues to indicate that they'll invest heavily in renewable power, including both wind and solar. Following the United States is Germany, and we can see here that Brazil and India have also been investing in this technology. When you look at manufacturing development, as already mentioned, Iowa is a leader in the manufacturing of wind turbine parks. We have several wind turbine manufacturers in the state. One particular reason for this is that our centralized location allows Iowa to produce some of the largest parts and then have them shipped by truck or barge around the country. And so you can see here in this graph, what we see is that's translated in part into a large number of wind projects and a significant amount of wind capacity. However, as a statewide, Texas leads the way in terms of wind power capacity. So this table here just goes to show again, in terms of capacity, Texas by far leading the way, more than almost 3 times as much as the second wind power generation state, which is Iowa. However, in terms of the percentage of in-state generation, Iowa leads the way. And in terms of wind power penetration, which is based on the per capita consumption of energy, Iowa is the leader in the United States. Obviously, the small population base helps in that regard, but we can't underestimate how much wind power is being generated in Iowa, which is in 2015 greater than places like California, Oklahoma, and even Illinois. I already mentioned that we're going to start seeing more offshore wind power projects. And so this figure here shows some of the locations where that's happening. We can see Hawaii investing in offshore wind power, North Carolina leading the way in terms of plant capacity. Many of these projects are in their early stage or in site control stage, and so it will be a few years before they're actually running, but uh, they they will be a significant contributor to the wind power generation capacity in the United States. We mentioned manufacturers, again, GE and Vistas leading the way, and we see that the percentage of total US market share has shifted in different years. In 2015, the most recent year, GE and Vistas almost equal share of the manufacturing capacity. These other manufacturers here, uh, some of them specialize in different parts of the turbine equipment, and so they never really go away in that regard. They can work together with other manufacturers to provide what's needed for the installation. So here you see where those manufacturing facilities are located and what types of parts they produce. As I already mentioned, Iowa here, we produce blades, we produce towers, we produce um, other parts of the facility. And those towers and blades can be shipped all around the country. That's due to our nice centralized location and transportation network. Very scarce manufacturing facilities in the west area, a few in Arizona and Oregon here. High concentration of manufacturers in the Midwest and Texas area. We already discussed how the dominance of independent power producers in the ownership of these wind power projects. However, there are some investor-owned utilities and publicly owned utilities where either private investors or the general public decides to invest in installing a wind farm for their residential areas um, or a company. And so you can see that investor-owned utilities are an increasing portion of the wind power generation installations. As I mentioned, a major driver for the investment in wind power is what's called the Renewable Portfolio Standard. As of July 2016, you can see here the percentage targets uh, established by the mandatory Renewable Portfolio Standard policies. And you can see, for example, Iowa, they're looking at 105 megawatts by 1999. And there are other percentages listed here for other states. This concludes our presentation on wind and solar power. I encourage you to read through some of the material provided and the reports on the renewable energy sector for further details.